Hello, and welcome back to Ave Imperator Productions. I am your host Sulla, and today we are going to be taking a look at the Byzantine social and political strategy from the death of Justinian to the rise of Heraclius. So, just real quick, to recap near the end of Justinian's reign, he had expanded the empire to a level unseen and to be unseen by the Byzantines for the rest of their history, but this came with a great cost. Normally, when you expanded your empire, especially at this time, but at just about any time, you gained new populations for taxes, smaller borders and frontiers, the possibility of new allies, and things like this. Unfortunately, near the end of Justinian's reign, there was a great outbreak of a new disease, which would later become known as the Black Death. In all likelihood, the Black Death was actually much more significant and damaging in its reach and in its death toll in the reign of Justinian, as opposed to in the 13th and 14th centuries. So, there was a great cleaning out. Over a quarter of the people in the Mediterranean basin ended up dead, and in some of the large metropolises of the Byzantine and other nearby empires, up to 3/4 could be found dead in these individual cities. The only saving grace, if you will, was that the disease was spread pretty far, including to the Persians and to the barbarians in Western and Northern Europe. So, at least for a little while, it sort of covered itself. The real problem was the destruction to not only trade and the average person, but also to the military. So the traders, the guildsmen, the artisans were the middle class. They created wealth which could be traded to enlarge the wealth of the overall nation. The farmers paid their tithes and their taxes, so they were the stable tax base. And then the other people who joined up in the military were the soldiers and were the fighting edge of the empire. All three of these castes suffered greatly, and in fact Justinian himself was afflicted by the Great Plague, but he did actually come out okay near the end of it. Unfortunately, he would go on to die a few years later. So when Justinian had reclaimed parts of Italy, Africa, the eastern parts of Spain, and expanded greatly the borders, he had an army of about 500,000 men, which he could use to police and to move back and forth and to patrol the borders. This was shrank to 120,000. Not only was it shrunken, the coffers were greatly diminished through the loss of trade and through the loss of taxpayers. And then the great emperor himself died. He wasn't actually seen all that favorably by the average person in Byzantium because he was a very stiff and a very steadfast leader. When he wanted something done, it was done. He was pretty sure that he knew what was best, and he was willing to execute it if he thought it was for the good of the empire. He was not the kind of person who governed by the will of the masses at the moment, and unfortunately he would be followed up by several who did, and we will see the consequences of switching from the good of the long term to the good of the immediate. So, after Justinian I came, likely, Justinian II. It makes sense, it was a pretty stable transition. The only problem was Justinian I himself might have been able to deal with the challenges of the empire as it was already crumbling, but Justinian II was not quite the man of his successor. He set out to enlarge the coffers by diminishing the payment to the soldiers, by persecuting certain sects of Christianity, namely the Monophysites, which were abundantly in Syria and Palestine and Egypt. This will become very important later. And he also sought refuge with the aristocrats, the senators, the high-minded and rich nobility to try and gain their favor and to try and use their wealth and resources to rebuild his empire. Unfortunately, this would not work, and Justinian II's work was cut out for him. He stretched the budget so thin, he taxed his people so hard, he paid his military so little that nobody really wanted to be a part any longer, and the whole empire started to bust at the seams. It's actually said that near the end of his reign, he began to go insane because he could not solve or address any of the major issues which his empire were deeply afflicted by. And being in the position of power, which it was necessary to fix these problems, and not being able to, would be a serious mind game that I don't think a lot of people could have withstood. Especially not his successor. Unfortunately, his successor would go in a very different direction. Who was that? So Justinian II had bouts of insanity or depression or whatever you want to call it, and when he had a lucid moment, he lifted up one of his generals, Tiberius, who was very well liked by his soldiers and overall by the people, to become the next ruler. He actually abdicated while he was still alive and told Tiberius, "I understand if you have to kill me." Tiberius was not that kind of guy, though. Tiberius wanted to be emperor for the same reason that someone today might want to be a pop star. He wanted the fame, and he wanted the undulation and the adoration of the masses, and he would receive it. So Tiberius is one example of an emperor or a leader who rules by the favorability of the moment, and this had calamitous results. Tiberius, near the beginning of his emperorship, found about 100,000 tons. 100,000 tons of gold. He just found it, said it was under a rock. This is hard to believe for a multitude of reasons, but he took this money which he found, which obviously the state didn't need since it didn't know it was going to be there, and distributed it out to the crowds. Now this might sound very nice. These people had this money, they could go and do something with it, but here's the reality of the situation. The roads were broken down. There were raiders coming in from all sides. There was rival empires trying to bring them down. There was an old military which desperately needed to be revamped. There was a bureaucracy which needed to be refitted. There was a lot of things that needed to be done to make the life of the average person better. And giving them a little bit of wealth, which would be gone in 2 weeks, was not a successful answer. It did, however, make him very popular, which was his end goal. And unfortunately, empires are not built on popularity, they're built on hard decisions. So Tiberius did some other things as well. Tiberius looked into starting new wars, but again, he wasn't interested in the well-being of the average person, he was interested in glory. The most glorious battles which he could achieve were against the largest opponents. So he set to work going to war against the Lombards in Italy, against the Franks in France, and against the Persians, all relatively great powers for the time, and all with borders far away from where the Byzantines actually were, which meant that there was nothing to gain whatsoever. Only thing that him and his armies could actually gain would have been glory. And it was actually worse than that. The uncivilized peoples to the north, the Slavs and above the Danube, were moving across into the Balkans, which was the farming heartland for the Byzantine Empire, or it would be soon after the collapse of Egypt. But he did not go after these because they were small armies, there wasn't a lot of glory to be had, it was just taking up farmland, which farms in Egypt were readily preparing the nation for anyways. What could possibly be the problem? Unfortunately, this would become a very large problem indeed for Greece. So he diminished the wealth, he diminished his own name by sort of acting like a buffoon, and he diminished the imperial and military authority of his state in search of glory and adulation. Tiberius did manage to do one thing, and that was to lose large swaths of territory, to the various invading tribes as they moved across the Danube, as they moved down into Italy, into the western provinces in Spain. He only went to war with those with whom he could spur on the public interest of the moment, and because of this, he had a very short-sighted and unsuccessful imperial reign. Okay, near the end of the reign of Tiberius, he came up with a similar problem as to his predecessor, Justinian II. There wasn't a very clear line of the passage of the crown, and that was actually a huge problem not only for the former Roman Empire, but would continue to be so for the Byzantine and for many other empires. Anyways, when Tiberius grew old, he looked out for a couple of his generals that he could elevate to the position of Augustus and later become the emperor himself. The one who got the title was none other than Maurice himself, who wrote the Strategicon, which we based much of the previous parts of this episode on. Maurice was a very good emperor, and he was the emperor that was needed at that time. Unfortunately, the masses had grown quite accustomed to getting whatever they wanted at the moment, and their own personal interests at that second being served rather than the actual interests of the empire and the long term. Maurice set out to reform the bureaucracy of the empire. He set out to reform the military, which was his most important contribution, and luckily he had just enough time to do this. He ended most of the petty, long-ranged wars that had crumbled the frontiers of the empire and refocused on the smaller groups which could be pushed directly out of Byzantine territory through campaigns of attrition and very long wars and many, many battles. This was not quite as glorious, and it only really used the soldiers as a sort of police or peacekeeping regiment rather than actual glorious striding into battle kinds of men. This didn't sit well with the people, and as we spoke of earlier, a lot of these Slavs which were being pushed back against the Danube had already moved across into the Balkans. One of these was Phokas, and Phokas was a commander in the Byzantine military at the time of the reign of Maurice. He was a Slav, and he had come across under the rule of Tiberius, and he did not see the new direction of the empire as being as profitable as it necessarily could have for the ruler. Phokas went with his men while Maurice was out campaigning and went straight to the capital and told them everything that they wanted to hear. He said he would give them what they wanted, he would give them wealth, he would give them glory in battle, and all they had to do was overthrow the tyrant Maurice. Unfortunately, the Byzantine Empire was not quite at as bad of a position as it needed to be for a true leader and a righteous king to come in and to sway the people to more practical uses of their time and resources. So Phokas was supported. He raised a large army and he pushed Maurice out of the empire itself, and that was the end of Maurice's reign. Phokas was a very brutal and extremely greedy leader. He stopped all of the wars with the minor peoples that were coming across to directly live in Byzantine lands, and he reawoken the Great War, the perennial struggle of Byzantium against Persia. This would be the final war that Byzantium ever engaged in with Persia, but not for good reasons, and practically speaking, the manpower and wealth of Persia would continue to be used against the Byzantines until the very end. Alright, thank you very much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed. If you did, make sure to leave a like. If you had any questions, feel free to leave it in the comments section. I address just about all of those. If you want to see more content like this, feel free to subscribe. But until next time, remember, Ave Imperator.